Welcome to Kingdom Commentaries, January 14th, 2007. This being one of our first episodes of the new year, we're fittingly going to discuss church leadership and how it started out, especially starting with the first century all the way to present. Rejoining us tonight is John Zens from SearchingTogether.com. Welcome, John.
Welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you again. Well, we are taking on quite an ambitious project, so to keep from being a 10-hour discussion, we're just going to get an overview, and then we'll have an accompanying article with some more detailed references. First, the leadership in the first century probably can be most accurately defined from Ephesians 4:11, where we read, "And he himself gave some to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, and some pastors and teachers." So here's the very first start of the first century leadership. Let's go ahead and explain a little bit more how that might have worked.
Well, in Philippians 1:1, you've got the statement of to Paul writing to the saints, bishops, and deacons, and that would seem to be the basic, you might say, local development as Paul summarizes it. And so, you know, the basic pattern I would see would be you've got Paul going into a city or a region, and he preaches, beginning in the synagogue and then moving out as the Lord leads to other places. But you have some converts, and they begin meeting house to house, and then as time goes on, there was recognition of the elders, and might add that, you know, the work of the apostles was of varying length, but it was fairly short, possibly as short as 2 weeks to maybe a year and a half. So, you know, whatever it wasn't very long, and they would just, you know, sort of get the believers grounded a bit, and then they'd move on their journey somewhere else, and then maybe, you know, in a year or two or whatever, would come back through, and possibly on at least some occasions would recognize elders in the midst, and all that. So you know, to me, the local leadership was emerged out of the flock, and there was apostolic, you might say, help in setting those people apart. But the way I see it is that the elders were recognized, you know, by the flock, and then the apostles, you know, would formalize, you might say, that recognition. So I don't think it would be right to say that the apostles chose the elders. It was the people who would recognize those in their midst, but the apostles would, you might say, sort of seal the recognition, and otherwise it would seem to me that it would be unnatural to just say the apostles chose the elders. You have Acts 6 where the apostles said, "Look out among yourselves for 7 men full of the Spirit and wisdom." So the people recognized the 7, and then the apostles laid their hands on them. So
that's the deacons there.
Yeah, that was not elders, but deacons, as we call them that. But anyway, so that's the general pattern. Of course, the word to recognize that's used in like Acts 14, you know, is like to, you might say, recognized by the raising of hands. Mm-hmm. And so again, that action wouldn't appear to be, you know, the apostles just unilaterally saying, "Here are your elders," but it would be the people, as it were, recognizing the elders, and then the apostles putting their benediction on that recognition, as it were.
Now, it seems a little bit more strong wording, though, because maybe I agree with you that the apostles, especially when you see the pattern in Timothy, where they're given a list of who to look for, what qualifications there were for an elder, but ultimately, everywhere you look in the New Testament, I'm looking at some of the text now, it always says that the elders were appointed. So ultimately, the apostles had to give the final stamp of approval. Now, the congregation may put somebody forth as an elder, but ultimately, the apostles had to give the appointment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you mentioned, though, when you've got the qualifications for elders mentioned in Timothy, mm-hmm. and then saying to Titus that I left you in Crete to appoint elders in every city. It's to me, it's a sort of a balance thing. I just have trouble with unilateral action of the apostles. I mean, I think the people had to do the discerning of who was functioning in their midst in various capacities, but certainly the elders, the apostles, were involved in the final setting apart of those people.
Right.
I can't deny that.
Even the deacons, I mean, it does say choose out among you, but the ultimate saying at the end is, and they appointed them. So they were brought before the apostles at that point, but the apostles are having the ultimate say-so.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know, just interesting dichotomy. I have never seen it until I started studying this issue, that it's always by appointment.
Mm-hmm.
So, something to look into further. So I didn't want to get too much of that. Just wanted to kind of take a look. So we see in the first century apostles and elders. Another thing we might look at is how they worked in tandem. Because in my research, we always think of, you have apostles and you have elders separately. But as you go further in the text, you'll see always that the apostles and elders were meeting together and making decisions together. Are you aware of how that works, or you have come across that in your studies?
Of course, you can mention the things that you see, but the only example I can think of would be Acts 15. I don't know of, too many examples where that would be the case, but of course, in Acts 15, the church was present while the apostles and elders were discussing the issue at hand. So, I mean, it wasn't without the people, but it was the elders and the apostles discussing with the people listening.
Right. Well, my point was that the elders were not making decisions on their own either. Mm-hmm. They were under the auspice of the apostles. Mm-hmm. Now, for instance, as you said, Acts 15:6, it says, "Now the apostles and elders came together to consider this matter." Now, most Christians, at least Protestant Christians today, think of apostles as inspired, but they think of elders as not inspired. Mm-hmm. But yet, we see in the New Testament, elders and apostles were making decisions in tandem. Mm-hmm. I don't know what that signifies, but it signifies something different than the position we gave elders.
Yeah. Well, I mean, can you think of any other examples of that in the New Testament?
Acts 16, "And as they went through the cities, they delivered them decrees to keep, which were determined by the apostles and elders."
Yeah, but that still refers to what happened in Acts 15. I'm saying about other examples of besides that.
There's other texts, I'll have to bring that out, but there's definitely other texts where you see the apostles and elders working in tandem with each other, making decisions that are decrees that people follow out.
Yeah.
So.
Well, to me that seems a little stretched, though, because given the fact that in the first century the apostles were not ubiquitous, and they certainly would not be able to be everywhere at once or be many places at once or many places at many times, for that matter. It just seems like the basic oversight of the local city, what was going on in the cities, would be the elders, and and then the apostles would certainly, if they were coming through or something, could look at various issues. But I personally don't see the elders making decisions in churches anyway. I mean, to me, it's more of the body working together to find the mind of Christ, not just the elders making decisions.
Right. Right. I'm not disagreeing with you there. What I'm trying to get at is that the elders in the first century are not even like we imagine them today. I think what you're painting more like is a big brother. I'm not so certain that's what they were in the first century. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that we're closer with the apostles, the inspired apostles. They have maybe, if we want to call it this, an oracle of God. Now, I'm not saying that, advocating that for today's elders. We'll move further in that. I believe the same way you do, that there was congregations operating even without elders. Mm-hmm. I think that's what you're trying to get at earlier. Am I wrong about that? Or
yeah, I mean, I would say that in Acts 14 you've got the congregation, as it were, without elders for possibly up to 2 years, and then when Paul and Barnabas come back through, then they recognize the elders. So I mean, they were. I think the early assemblies went some period of time without elders, and then they were recognized later, at some point.
So they were able to operate even without elders.
Right, and they were also a church.
And there's not chaos then, even without
There
elders.
was the ordained elders in every church, so the church was already in existence before the elders, were around. So that, to me, is against the idea that some people have, that you don't have a church unless you have elders, and I don't think that's biblical.
Right. All right, well, there's the first century. I'll add more references to it. There's a couple other things we could get into, but like I said, just a cursory overview.
Right.
Anything you want to move on before we move on to
I would just summarize a bit by saying that the word that would characterize what you see in the ethos of the New Testament would just be the simplicity. In other words, there was not a developed hierarchy. There wasn't a clergy-laity divide. It was basically the multiple ministry going on among the brethren and all that, and you had prophets and other ministries going on too. So you had both resident ministries and itinerant ministries, and it was just sort of a fluid. There was a fluidity there that was not boxed up or predetermined. It was just happening as the Spirit led and all that. So that's what we'll see, of course, in subsequent years was lost.
Right. Well, that's a perfect segue then. So we come into about the 2nd century. We're overlapping our dates here. These aren't hard and set dates, but by the time we get to the 2nd century, all the apostles, the original apostles, have since passed on. Mm-hmm. And even in history, I don't care where your biblical stance is on whether there's apostles for today or not, but in history, we don't see any kind of recognition of apostles in the 2nd century. Now comes bishops and archbishops. Kind of tell us, first of all, how it is that there's no mention of apostles, and then we'll get into why we have bishops and archbishops.
Right. Obviously the data is not, we don't have a lot of data, from which to draw, but in terms of just sketchy things, I would just mention that around 150 AD, you've got Clement mentioning the words, like clergy and laity and the word priest, and so you've already got, even by then, the nomenclature that would indicate a divide between the people and the leaders, which was not revealed in the New Testament, and so that to me would be sort of a springboard for further ecclesiastical hierarchy development, and so I think Clement was sort of in terms of the information we have to see, would be a turning point, in terms of opening up the door for ecclesiastical developments that were not in the New Testament. And I think, by the way, I don't know if maybe this needs to be tied in, but of course in the early church you had people that were designated as apostles that were not among the 12, so I call that, big capital A were the 12, and then lowercase a were people like Barnabas and Junia and other people that are titled apostles. So I don't know, how you feel about that, but anyway, that would have some bearing on the idea that there were apostolic assistants like Timothy and Titus.
I would say apostles by proxy, maybe.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, the point is that you've got the rise also probably, say, between 175 to say 300. You had the onslaught of the pagan philosophies and all, and there was a concern, for the Christian faith to reply to these pagan philosophies and all, and so that seems to be tied into the development of the bishop, where you had the territorial idea, so you'd have a bishop over a territory, and this bishop became like the spokesperson for Christianity against the pagan philosophers and ideologies, and so that there seems to be a tie-in there of the unity of the faith was to be maintained by the bishops, to whom it was said were entrusted, the faith.
The geographical unity.
Yeah. So it would say by at least 250 A.D. you've got the development of what you might call the one bishop rule, where you've got, of course, not just one bishop, but you'd have various bishops, but they would be over various territories. And of course, as far as we can tell then, that emerged later into where you had the main bishop of Rome,
right,
which would be then ultimately called the Pope.
Okay, well, let's back up because we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. I agree with you, but let's back up here then.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to the apostles, capital A, and apostles, lowercase a, from the time of AD 70? Because AD 70 obviously was a transition. There was a destruction of the whole old covenant system, and by that time, from most people's records, even Philip Schaff, who was a famous church historian, all the apostles, capital A, were basically killed. Some people claim that John the apostle still lived on, but there's a dispute about that, whether it's him or his work that lived on.
Right.
But at any rate, all the apostles shortly after the first century, capital A apostles, were gone, and also you don't even see the lowercase apostles. All of a sudden, there's a slow transition, I think you touched on a little bit, where now you have geographical bishops in control.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, of course, yeah, that's obviously documents of this era are pretty scanty, and so there's not a lot of information, but I suppose you might have something from Eusebius as a sort of a historian of that period, but I'm not, a detail man on that particular, Eusebius's works and all. But in any event, you have the basic stepping stone to me would be with Clement dividing the leaders from the people, and then moving on into the one bishop rule over the territorial thing. And so basically the what would you say, the fluidity, the multiple ministry dimension, is seems to then just it's lost, and you have the emergence more of an institutional approach and existence rather than a spirit-led, more vulnerable kind of existence that you find in the New Testament.
Right. And speaking of the history, I'm looking here at, again, Philip Schaff, and he says, I think it's in Volume 2, he's talking about the rise of the clergy-laity distinction. And in this, let's see, for anyone who's interested, I'll make sure I post this, but it says, in the apostolic church, preaching and teaching were not confined to particular class, but every convert could proclaim the gospel to unbelievers, and every Christian who had the gift could pray and teach and exhort the congregation. In the New Testament, the New Testament knows no spiritual aristocrats or nobility, but calls all believers saints, though many fell short of their vocation. Nor does it recognize a special priesthood and distinction from the people as mediating between God and the laity.
Mm-hmm.
So,
that's a very good summary.
Amazing
statement, right?
Right, and he's taken as a very, very well researched and documented church historian.
Right, and so to me that would indicate again that Philip Schaff would just represent many other historians and theologians of all various theological stripes who admit that the early church was simple. It didn't have a clergy-laity divide and things like that. But then when it comes to later post-apostolic history, it's like they don't seem to see any big problem with all the developments that came that turned the church into an ecclesiastical monster, instead of the simple functioning that you had in the New Testament age.
Right. I'll just paraphrase here. Also, he goes on to mention how that the Jewish system had the three offices: high priest, priest, and Levite. Then you move to Christianity, where we have instituted so-called threefold ministry with bishop, priest, and deacon. At least in the early days of Christianity that we're talking about right now, the second century. Mm-hmm. And it was a perfect fit, especially also with the Roman autocratic system there as well.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So they were trying to mimic the world, it seems like, if anything.
Right.
Having their own dukes or kings or priests over their own geographical area.
Yeah, so it would appear that perhaps there was a dual drawing from, you might say, number one would be drawing from the Old Testament priesthood images, and then drawing from the Greek and Roman philosophical and ideological wells that existed, and so between the two, you end up with a more defined hierarchy instead of the spontaneous freedom reflected in the New Testament.
Right. So there enters the bishop and archbishops. I believe we've more or less defined it and gave some validity to it from Philip Schaff there.
Right.
Okay, any more on that?
Yeah, I guess maybe you could just, I guess maybe we need next to maybe reflect on the advent of Constantine and that sort of thing.
Right. So we have this kind of encompasses the 2nd century to 4th century. Constantine somewhere about the 4th century. Go ahead and take it from there.
I might add that in this period you just mentioned, around say 250 AD or so, then you've got Cyprian and Irenaeus, and they're making statements like submit to the bishop and you submit to God. So in other words, you have that authority being attached to the office, and so that when the bishop speaks, he speaks for God, and therefore the laity have to submit to these leaders, and that reflects their submission to the Lord. So certainly that was a retroactive or a retrogressive kind of thing, because
right.
now you're submitting to a hierarchy and assuming that they have the will of God, when in fact they may not.
Even the inspired apostles like Paul allowed himself or wanted himself to be tested by the Bereans.
Right.
He didn't expect people just to listen to whatever he said, but now have you enter the bishops, like you said, Ignatius and Cyprian and some of the other ones, and they're telling people to submit to, actually these are not even inspired men.
Right.
So that's even worse.
So that certainly opened up a Pandora's box of confusion and misdirecting people from God's word to men, and it's no wonder then that the ecclesiastical hierarchy just accelerated after those kind of statements were made, and it just contributed, terribly to a spiraling down of a loss of the New Testament perspective.
Right. Now you mentioned Constantine. I have a lot of non-Christian friends who they have some knowledge of history, and they always start with Constantine. They'll say, see, look, whatever Christianity was before Constantine, it is no longer the same. Constantine took Christianity and turned it into some Roman bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. And to some degree, there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
For at least a certain period of time. Go ahead and maybe take it from there.
Right. Well, as you know, there were roughly 10 cycles of persecution before Constantine's advent, and so there were times, depending on the emperor and all that Christians would be harassed and killed and all, and then there might be a few years of peace, and then you'd have another cycle of persecution and all that. So when Constantine came on the scene around 315 to 325, you ended up with him having an alleged experience of the sign of the cross in the sky and all, and to conquer in this sign, he was told, and so he turned Christianity into a recognized state religion when it had been, of course, a persecuted minority, and so now you've got sort of a monumental shift from the church being a counterculture to the church being the culture, and so it certainly was a turning point, and unfortunately not for the best. It was more for the worst. So now you had Constantine using state money to fund the clergy and to fund the building of Christian cathedrals, etc. So now you've got the state encroaching into religious matters. And then, of course, Constantine was involved in the council at Nicaea, and so really people don't, realize this usually, that a lot of these early church councils, if not all of them, were called by civil and ecclesiastical things. It wasn't just, the church saying, we need to discuss this matter, but it was, the ruler was involved, the prince or the king or whatever, and that certainly, as history amply demonstrates, was ridiculous, because it wasn't exegesis or opening up scripture that was being used, but rather it was, in political intrigue and bribes and different things going on where the outcome wasn't really based on searching the scriptures. It was based on who knew who and, all that kind of stuff.
Right. There's even supposable accusation that one reason Constantine wanted the Christians to become formalized is because he needed an army. He's seen all this group of Christians bickering, and to bring peace to his empire, he said, now look, we need to have some meetings, we need to have some councils where we come up with the final decision, and then he could organize all these Christians into his army, and shortly after, a lot of them did join his army.
Right,
so,
and of course, this isn't direct to our subject, but prior to that, of course, the Christian, you might say the basic Christian position is that they refused to be in the army, because you had to acknowledge Caesar as Lord, and they couldn't do that, and so, they couldn't be part of the military service.
Although as soon as you said that, I was thinking of Cornelius and talking about how don't leave the state which you were called in, and therefore Cornelius, being a soldier, a Roman soldier, there's no indication that he left being a soldier after he converted to being Christian. So
right.
But yeah, I see your point. A lot of Christians still did. They were pacifists at that time.
Yeah, but of course, even with Cornelius, you don't know that at a future time, if they would have required him to say Caesar as Lord, he might have, he might have had to, say no.
Right. Speculation on our part. You're right.
Right.
All right. So here we have the rise of the. We looked at the apostles. We looked at the elders, how they worked in tandem, and how also there were congregations even without elders that operated, and there was no chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Then we looked at the rise of the bishops and the archbishops through the geopolitical system, and Constantine's formalizing. And now you've given us hint to how, first of all, some of the early church fathers, if we'll call them that, were requiring people to submit to the bishop. Well, that even took further to submit to the bishop, which becomes in the primacy of the pope. So give us an idea of how we went from individual bishops over many different cities to one bishop over the entire church.
Well, yeah, I can't claim to be an expert on the details of that, but there was always an underlying push for, you might say, visible unity in the organization of the emerging church that was called, you have the early Roman Catholic Church, and then after a certain point you'd have like the Roman Catholic Church. But in any event, you had already had the territorial bishops, and maybe you know more than I do, but for whatever reason there came to be the assumption that there was a primacy to Rome, and so the Bishop of Rome became sort of the overseer of the other bishops over the other territories, and so you had the crystallization of a big organization that would have this hierarchy and have its tentacles spread out, here and there, and so it was obviously then you've got, always have correspondingly the development of more traditions and more rituals and more relics and all these different things that are multiplying along with the developing hierarchy that's coming into solidity.
Right. Well, here again, I'll quote Philip Schaff here. He says, in the external organization of the church, several important changes appear in the period before us, and we're talking about between 2nd and 6th century.
Mm-hmm.
The distinction of the clergy laity and the secretal view of the ministry becomes prominent and fixed. Subordinate church offices are multiplied, and the episcopate arises. The beginnings of the Roman primacy appear, and the exclusive unity of the Catholic Church develops itself in opposition to the heretics and schismatics.
Right.
So basically, as you're saying here, there's this concept, and I think it's almost a worldly concept. There always needs to be somebody at the top.
Right. Now, of course, we know there was this would be another topic, as it were, but I mean, it is important to at least mention that you do have the development, of course, of the Eastern Church, and so you've had a divide there, and that, but again, they're both very hierarchically based and all that. It's
right.
just that the Eastern Church doesn't acknowledge the Roman bishop to be the prime.
That divide doesn't come until about 1055, somewhere around there. So we'll get to that. We're here soon. But you had all these, whether it's east or west, you had territorial bishops, archbishops. Eventually, and I don't know if it's because of the rise of the fact that Rome was the center of the Roman Christian Empire, and eventually, it just made sense to have that bishop be the main bishop. I know there's revisionist history that says that, like the text, and I'll just paraphrase it right here, out of Matthew 18, where Jesus calls Peter the rock, and on this rock I'll build a church, and he says that whatever you bind or loose in heaven or on earth shall be bound or loosed in heaven. And that's usually the Catholic response to why there is a pope. Whereas if you look in, for instance, Matthew 16, again paraphrasing, that same context is used about people binding and loosing. There Jesus is addressing not just Peter, but all the apostles, saying whatever they bind. So to me it kind of breaks down.
In Matthew 18, when Jesus says if they won't listen to witnesses, take it to the ecclesia, the church, and then he mentions binding and loosing after that. So in other words, there you've got the Christian congregation doing the binding and loosing.
Right. Even we'll get this when we get to that far, but even in present day, we think that when we take issues to the church, we take it towards the leadership, but it doesn't say that. It says take it to the congregation, the church. So, But so here we have the rise of the papacy, the primacy of the papacy, because of one, maybe because of just the fact that it's there in the central of the Roman Empire. Two, because either at the time or through revision, they've kind of seen the Pope as being the key holder to be able to have primacy over all. Wasn't
there some tradition that Peter ended up in Rome, and that maybe that was the impetus for thinking that that's where the prime seat should be?
Yes, there's tradition of that, but there's no biblical evidence that he necessarily ever went to Rome that way. We definitely see Paul there. That's how Acts ends. He's there in house arrest. If anybody should be patterning an apostolic office, maybe it should be based on Paul. He's the one who was in Rome.
Exactly.
But instead we have Peter.
And of course Peter had a mother-in-law, so that would sort of shoot down the idea that Peter was celibate.
Definitely. A lot of the parallels definitely aren't the same. So.
And of course Jesus said, "Call no man father," and of course you've got the development of father this and that in the Roman Catholic and other traditions. So they certainly didn't have any problem, disobeying what I would see as a prohibition of such designations.
Definitely. And we referenced this earlier, how it seems like some of the early Christians, 2nd century on, were trying to emulate the Jewish system, and Pope fits the perfect model of high priest. Definitely with all the other sub-priests around him.
Especially with all the ecclesiastical garb that they wear too, is parallel to the Old Testament priesthood.
Kissing of the ring. I don't imagine the fisherman Peter's going around asking people to kiss his ring.
Exactly.
So there's not many parallels. I didn't want to get too much objectionable to the Pope. We're just trying to outline an unbiased thing here. But as Protestants, obviously, I can't avoid that. But so we see the rise of the Pope and the priest class system. Anywhere between, obviously it starts as far back as Constantine, but it gets its main impetus somewhere about 600 on.
So I would, obviously the age from, say, 600 or 800 AD up until, 1500 is usually called the Dark Ages and the medieval times. And the thing that I would just overview on that would just be how the church controlled people's lives from cradle to grave, and you were born and baptized as a baby, and then when you were married, you had the sacrament of marriage, and of course you were having the sacrament of Mass weekly or whatever, and then you had when you got to the end of your life, you had the sacrament of last rites. So in other words, from cradle to grave, the church had its thumb on people, and I think that's just an important point, because it's hard for us to relate to that, to think of a church that is so controlling that, your every moment is basically shadowed by this monstrous ecclesiastical machine, and they're telling you what to do, what not to do, when to do it, where to do it, and if you don't do it, you're going to be punished, and it's just really hard for us to conceive, but that's the way it was.
Well, let me play the opposite side here for a moment. Let's pretend I'm a Roman Catholic, because I would take that comparison and say, well, you see it as monstrously evil, but I see it as a perfect comparison to the Old Testament covenant system where, yes, their whole life revolved around being part of the covenant community. And Roman Catholicism is a perfect match for that.
Right.
That's what I'd say as a Roman Catholic, at least.
Mm-hmm. Well, my fundamental response to that would have to be that I believe that the New Covenant Scriptures are to be our guide in our personal lives and our ecclesiastical life. And so, as I look through the pages from Matthew to Revelation, I don't see, the picture of the Roman Catholic Church emerging, and having the kind of control over people's lives and having all these sacraments, and as you said, having a fisherman wearing all this garb and all that. In other words, the early church was so simple, and it just didn't have all this stuff. And so my reply would be that there's so many blessings that are being missed by focusing on organizations and all this ritual and everything, and missing the very spirit of Jesus in terms of what I feel when he says he's building his church. I believe it's totally different than what people conceive of. I mean, he's not building the Roman Catholic Church. He's building a community of believers who follow him and love him.
Right. Which will introduce us now to make sure we're not too ahead of ourselves, but would be about the 1500s, late 1400s, the Reformation. So for about, let's say, 1100 years. Oh, actually, let's back up. Sorry, I messed up here. Let's back up just a little bit because we didn't talk about the Greeks. You mentioned that. Mm-hmm. So we have the Greek Eastern Orthodox congregations, the bishops and such, and they didn't have it at one time. They didn't have this primacy of Pope.
Right.
And at some point, once Rome started exerting its authority over all the church, there was a split. I think it was about 1055. I'll make sure I have the right documentation.
I think it's 1054.
Right around there.
Yeah.
Do you know any more details about that?
Well, not a great deal, but of course it revolved around certain. I would say that the divide, as I see it anyway, I could be ignorant of some things, but it doesn't appear to me to be any major doctrines that the split was over, but it was more a question of control and sort of the idea of the apostolic succession. It was issues related to the hierarchy more than it was over specific doctrine. And even maybe I can think of one doctrinal issue, which to me would be pretty small. But what the idea of does Christ proceed from the Father and the Son? I'm sorry, does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son, or from the Son only? They had these different nuances regarding the relationship of the Trinity and stuff like that to me were very hair-splitting, and it certainly didn't merit, splitting over.
Right.
But anyway, the Eastern Church certainly has a lot of the flavor of the Roman Catholic Church, but they do have some different convictions. So I guess they ended up separating, and of course we can't forget that involved in all this history that we're talking about is the civil dimension, because you just can't separate it, because depending on who was the leader at the time, the civil leader, or king or prince or whatever, that ties in to a lot of these ecclesiastical disputes. So they were all wrapped up, and we need to keep that, in front of our eyes.
Right. Now, I know at a later time, and I think even to the present day, unfortunately I don't know his name, but I believe even the Eastern Orthodox Church has a type of pope, patriarch, they call him.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Like a Holy Father.
Of course, their seat of authority was Constantinople.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so the split may have been not so much over the primacy of the Pope, but more geographical necessity.
Yeah, right. I'm sure there were multiple reasons for that divide, but certainly the doctrinal disputes, as I understand it, were fairly minor.
Mm-hmm. All right, now we'll get to the Reformation. About 1500, now all of a sudden we have, and everybody pretty well knows Martin Luther, but there were other ones before him. You had John Huss, and you had John Wycliffe in England. I think it was about 1300s. Mm-hmm. So Luther wasn't the first. These were rumblings going on for a couple hundred years.
Right.
And
I guess maybe we should just mention right up front that the Reformation was in the context of the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg, and certainly that was a very pivotal invention, because the Roman Catholic Church had always been able to control the information that was going to people, and now with the invention of the printing press, you had the ability, a growing ability, increasing ability, to disseminate ideas that were contrary to the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church had kept the Bible in its own possession, and so the people, of course, didn't read the Scriptures. It was in the hands of the leaders. But anyway, so the Reformation providentially, was able to take advantage of the development of the printing press, so that the Reformation ideas could be disseminated, and that certainly opened the door for accelerating the theological divide.
Certainly. So once the Scripture gets into the hands of the common man, where they can read it themselves and now oppose what the bishops and popes said, hey, look, it doesn't say this in the Scriptures, basically.
Right.
You had the monks reading it for themselves now, sharing it with individuals, common man, and they're coming to conclusions that this whole structure is not right.
Right.
It's almost like they're waking up from a giant conspiracy.
Right. So, as Luther, was obviously seeing corruption in the church, then of course we know Tetzel's selling of indulgences was sort of the last straw for Luther, and then he published or put his theses on the door at Wittenberg and all that, and so that was the beginning of it. But we might as well just get to the point here, since we're discussing church government. And while the Reformation certainly opened up some theological vistas that were important, unfortunately, the reformers to a man did not separate from Constantinian ideas, so that in the Reformation countries you ended up with state churches, and
right.
So nothing changed. They just put the Roman Catholics out of power and put themselves.
All right. Well, don't get too far ahead of me.
Okay.
Here's what Luther said. He was before a trial, basically, and one of the major things he said, which I find interesting, because he says this, and then, as you said, here shortly after, a lot of the reformers turn around and basically shackle people under the same shackle. But here's what Luther said. He says, I answer, they were asking him who gave him the authority to question popes, basically. And he says this, I answer that God once spoke through the mouth of an ass. I will tell you straight that what I think. I am a Christian theologian. I am bound not only to assert, but to defend the truth with my blood and death. I want to believe freely and be the slave to no authority, whether council, university, or pope. I will confidently confess what appears to me to be true, whether it has been asserted by a Catholic or a heretic, whether it has been approved or reproved by a council. That's strong words, but shortly after that, Luther doesn't allow anybody else to take up that claim.
Right. Well, that's unfortunately what history shows, too, is that when people who want toleration get into power, they often don't grant toleration to the others.
Right.
So, Luther, certainly struggled. I mean, Luther admitted, for example, in his best moments, that he couldn't find infant baptism in the Scriptures, and yet he practiced that, and of course, joining the Anabaptists wrote to Luther and asked him to have believers' churches instead of the state thing, and he basically said, well, I agree with you, that'd be nice, but I can't find any disciples to meet simply with. And so, Luther took the hand of the prince and ended up, having a state church instead of a believer's church.
Right.
So, again, the government of the Reformation churches, the church government, they removed the sacrament table out of the middle and had the pulpit in the middle, but it ended up being their ministers were just becoming, as we have said in our first interview, that you had now little Protestant popes,
many popes,
instead of one major pope.
Well, let me quote Luther again. This is later on. I mean, that was his original, the original quote I just gave, but here's one later on which contradicts. He says, "We have enough to do if we just carry out that which has been committed to our own charge. Nor can one use the argument that all Christians are priests. It is true that Christians are priests, but they are not all pastors. Then over and above that he is a Christian and a priest, he must needs also to have an office in a parish that has been committed to his charge. The call and the charge makes the pastor and preacher. He just pulls this out of thin air.
Right.
You know, this is the rise of the individual pastor. It came out of Luther's mouth.
Right.
You don't see that anywhere in the New Testament. I mean, people say, look, Timothy and Titus are examples of an individual pastor. No, they weren't. Matter of fact, they were going through the cities appointing elders.
Right.
They were apostle proxies.
Right.
I don't even think they had their own congregation. If you look at the text.
No, I don't think so.
They were itinerant preachers, if anything else.
They were apostolic assistants.
Right. So this individual pastor concept is nowhere to be found in the New Testament, and then here you see it rising its head.
Right.
In the Reformation, basically taking away from the papal authority and giving to the Protestants that same authority.
Right. So again, as Luther just mentioned in this quote, the Reformation certainly gave lip service to reviving the priesthood of all believers, but in praxis, unfortunately, it just didn't work out because you ended up still having the focus on the clergy, and the laity were to receive from the preaching of the minister, and, you know, it really didn't open up a true functioning of the priesthood of all believers, where you had various ministries edifying the body. It ended up focusing on the person in the pulpit, and that was pretty much, you know, the important ministry.
Now, there were definitely some rumblings. I mean, there was one of his fellow, I believe, a university professor, Andreas Karlstadt, at the university there with Luther, actually took on the concept, along with some other radical concepts that we may even reject, that there was this priesthood of believers, that there was no one person in authority. Christ was our only high priest. Christ was our only authority. And some of the peasants also picked up on that, but I believe from my reading that a lot of the peasants, their ambition wasn't for religious or spiritual freedom. Theirs was more for political freedom. They were trying to get out from under the domination of the dukes and princes.
Right.
So you have that mixed in there too.
Right. Yes. So again, unfortunately, I think, you know, too many people in our generation sort of view the Reformation as being a sort of a pure spiritual movement away from the excesses of the Roman Catholic Church. But, I mean, I honestly have to say that just isn't true, because as Kenneth Scott Latourette, who's a, you know, renowned Christian historian, he admitted that if it weren't for the power of the prince, that the Reformation principles would not have advanced in many places. So, I mean, really, the arm of the state provided the backbone for the spread of the Reformation. And if the Reformation had gone to the concept of the Anabaptists of having believers' churches, and of course it was the Anabaptists who were persecuted and chased both by the Protestants and the Roman Catholic Church, and so, you know, the Constantinianism is a horrible thing, and unfortunately the Reformation was infected with Constantinianism, so it really ruined a movement that had some potential, but the theology was certainly an improvement over the Roman Catholic thing, but the overall practice ended up being very detrimental.
No, the church leadership wasn't too much reformed. Definitely the soteriology, but the ecclesiology didn't really feel the full effect of Reformation.
Exactly.
Reading again, I think I read this quote again, but let me read it in full context here from Philip Schaff. He says, "The New Testament knows no spiritual autocracy." I never can say that word. Aristocracy.
Oh, aristocracy.
Yeah. I can never say that word.
Yeah.
That shows you what I mean about that. Or nobility, but calls all believers saints, though many fell short of their vocation. Nor does it recognize a special priesthood and distinction from the people as mediating between God and the laity. It knows of only one high priest, Jesus Christ, and clearly teaches the universal priesthood as well as universal kingship of believers.
Right.
It does this in as far as deeper and larger sense in the sense too that when even to this day is not fully realized. This is from Philip Schaff,
right?
The prominent church historian. I mean, he's admitting exactly what we're saying here.
Right. So, and of course, I found that in my own studies over the years that church historians and theologians of all stripes basically admit to the truth of the basic lines that you and I are drawing in our description of Christian history, and you know, it's just that few people seem to care. In other words, they don't realize that, well, should we be concerned about this? And it's like most people figure, well, the status quo must be God's will, and, they're not really willing to search the Scriptures.
Well, was the status... That makes no sense for a Protestant to say that, because for what? It was almost 1,300 years we had the Roman Catholic Church domination.
Right.
That was the status quo, but yet, would they still want that today?
Right. So the Reformation was pretty good at reforming, as you said, the doctrine of salvation, but in terms of ecclesiology, their steps were... They made a few steps, but any steps they made were basically canceled out by the remaining vestiges of Constantinianism, and which of course were brought even to our country in its inception, and you have the developments there.
And plus, I think the Reformers kind of betray their own motto. The motto in the Reformation is reformed and always reforming. Well, it seems like they have stopped.
And sola scriptura.
Right.
So, I mean, it's one thing to say Scripture only, but you read that statement from Luther about not everybody has a parish and all, and that's simply not in the New Testament. So, when push came to shove, Luther didn't have Scripture to back up some of his crucial thinking.
No, he invented the called pastor, and I, every time I read it, I was like, where are you getting this, Luther? I'm thinking, you're pulling out of thin air. I mean, what gave you right to oppose the Pope and yet call yourself pastor?
Right.
They're the ones that gave you office in the first place.
Right. And of course, the Puritans even came up with a couple of more offices. They came up with the office of doctor, and so people have invented other things. And of course, today we've got the senior pastor and all these other names that the New Testament knows nothing about.
Now, you mentioned the Anabaptists, and I've been a Baptist for 15 years. Or I'm not one now, but I've been a Baptist by recognition. Interesting enough, they also, and probably more tenaciously, hold to the individual pastor model than even other, Presbyterians, where they hold to at least maybe a less invasive model, which is the plurality of elders, probably closer to the New Testament. But the Baptists have even lost ground by having an individual pastor.
Right. Yeah. So well, again, it's just like whether it's Assembly of God or Baptist or Presbyterian, they sort of all end up with a form of the one pastor rule, and so it really doesn't make any difference which denomination you look at. They all end up saying that the buck stops with the pastor, and again, that's just so far from the New Testament.
Now, somebody listening to this will say this, and usually this is the first objection. Well, you have to have somebody in control, otherwise it's chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we started this discussion talking about how there were first-century congregations that didn't even have elders, yet there was no chaos.
Right.
And so
I think that's important, a very important point, because in the New Testament, you didn't have the focus on one leader or even a few, and there wasn't chaos. And I think, again, it was a Spirit-led, I would call it an ordered spontaneity, and sure, it was vulnerable. It was very susceptible to problems. But the point is, the New Testament seems to envision a situation like that, where we're dependent on the Holy Spirit and not boxed in and predetermining everything. And so, yes, there is vulnerability, and I think that's a big thing that most people don't like. They like everything to be in a church bulletin where everything is secure and it's safe and all that. But vulnerability is a mark of New Testament church life, but it was lost, and all denominations have basically moved toward a centralized authority, and it's so sad, because even though they've done that, we all know from empirical observation that it doesn't work, because all these churches with one pastor, they split, they divide.
Right, I was going to mention that. It's an illusion to think there's not vulnerability with just a single pastor. Usually, the main reason why churches split, there's some kind of problem with the pastor, whether he falls from some kind of indiscretion or some conflict somewhere and then there's a church split. So sometimes he's the focus of the cause of the invulnerability. If the church was just a bunch of members on equal footing, nobody would have as much prominence as anybody else. So if somebody fell, it wouldn't drag the entire church with them.
Right. Yeah, and again, the pastor is embedded in an entire system, and that system has so many accoutrements attached to it that it's when one domino starts falling, they just all collapse. So the pastor's like the linchpin of probably 15 or 20 different church traditions, and if people don't have that pastor, it's like they feel they don't have church.
Right.
And it's really sad. Now, of course, that brings up the issue of is that people really don't want responsibility for ministering. In other words, they want to pay somebody to do the ministering instead of being a body where we all participate as guided to edify the whole. It's easier just to pay people to do ministry, and that's pretty much where we've ended up.
Right. I've actually had folks say, well, look, I work 40 hours a week. I don't have time to dig into the Word as much as I would like, so I have to have somebody who's able to take that time, devote their entire life to it, to teach. To me, it's nothing different than the Pope system, then. If you're going to rely upon one man to feed you.
Well, plus everything you just said about working 40 hours a week, I mean, number one, the elders in the New Testament appear to be working men for the most part, so it wasn't like they were all supported. And number two, it assumes a false model about the sermon, in that you have to spend 40 hours preparing a sermon every week, and that's bogus, because that's not a New Testament standard either. So, I mean, if you had, say, 20 people who worked 40 hours a week, all come together, and each person shared 10 minutes or 5 minutes of something the Lord showed them or whatever, wouldn't that be wonderful? In other words, that would be quite a bit of time. It wouldn't be a lack of time. So it's a question of sharing the ministry with one another, and it would be so much more edifying than just hearing one person's speech every week.
Amen. And we're more in that position today than we ever have been, because we have the codified Bible. We have all of it in one piece.
Right.
In the New Testament, they were still combining all of it together, and even then they weren't listening to sermons. They weren't listening to one man speak.
Right.
And so now that we have the entire Bible codified in one place, we can bring what we've been studying about it together, and there would not be any confusion or chaos, especially if it's kept to a smaller degree.
Sure.
So.
And that doesn't mean there can't be problems, because it is a vulnerable organism, and so sure, there can be problems, but you handle those problems by dealing with them in a loving way. You don't have to just say, well, we refer these things to our pastor and he figures them out. I mean, that's not, that's immaturity. That's not maturity.
Okay, well, we beat up on single individual pastors long enough here. Now let's move real quick, and then we'll probably close up here soon about the Presbyterian model, where they have a plurality of elders. Now, this sounds like a perfect setup, but again, the buck has to stop somewhere even with this system.
Yeah, the Presbyterians, I'm saying this from my own observation and experience and looking at their writings, it seems to me that they have some good theories, but that the theories don't seem to usually work out in practice. So one of the systems I'm most familiar with would be the Orthodox Presbyterian system, and what happens is, in all of them, is that you still end up with the minister. So you still have a person who's separate from the rest of the
teaching elder and ruling elders.
So really, you still have the clergy laity thing. There's no difference. But the thing that is supposed to be different about Presbyterianism is that they allegedly say that you have more of an appeal, because if you are dissatisfied with something, then you have the ability to appeal to a broader body of elders or something.
Synod and general council and such.
Yeah, and even to their general assembly that meets, every year or something. And again, my observation and listening to other Presbyterians who've been in it is that, again, it's good in theory, but it just doesn't seem to work out in practice, because I don't know how many people have been so frustrated with the Presbyterian system when they have appealed, and it still ends up being politics and, who knows who and all that, and it just, even though it sounds fair, it still doesn't work out, because you have that strong clergy-laity distinction, and there's just that idea, that you're not ordained, you're not, you're a peon.
Right. Now let me say a few things here, and then I'll give you the last closing words here. Obviously, we are not encouraging any individuals, no matter what church system model you're in, to flee from it. We're just keeping you in mind that no matter whether it be pope or pastor or elders, the Bible doesn't call you to be under men like that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in there and everything's working fine, I'm not encouraging people to necessarily leave that. They just need to keep in mind that these men don't have that kind of authority over them.
Right. And I would just add that I just feel strongly that we're just missing so many blessings by having moved away from simplicity. And when people come back to simplicity and meet around the Lord and His Word and have multiple participation and all, it's so wonderful. And I have experienced that, and it's just so sad that people end up in a dead-end system that just perpetrates focus on a few. And Paul says the body is not one member but many, and yet the way we function in today's churches, it basically is one person and not many. And so I think it's sad, and I like to look at it sort of in a positive way. In other words, why don't we want the blessing that we could have by meeting in simplicity? Why don't we return to those things where Jesus put His benediction?
Amen. Okay, any closing words beyond that?
Nope, that's pretty much it.
All right, well, we plan to have you again, and I thank you for going through this history lesson with us tonight, but I plan to have you again with the eschatological ramifications of church